Hi, and welcome to the Turbulent World with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is jumping through hoops on his 11th Middle East tour in the past year as he attempts to revive the stalled Gaza ceasefire talks and secure agreement on post war arrangements in the Strip. Mr. Blinken is discovering that Israeli Prime Minister Binyamin Netanyahu may not be the only party pooper. So is Mahmoud Abbas, the internationally recognized West Bank-based Palestinian president. Mr. Blinken is touting a United Arab Emirates proposal for the administration of Gaza once a ceasefire has been achieved. The proposal was crafted with input from Israel, but not the Palestinians. That's where the rub starts. Palestinian sources said a senior U.S. official shared the Emirati proposal with Mr. Abbas and his dysfunctional Palestine Authority only days ago. The sources said Mr. Abbas rejected the proposal for one reason. It did not involve Palestinians in determining their future and governance. They also said Mr. Abbas opposed Emirati involvement in post war Gaza. Some U.S. officials fear that the UAE and Israel see the proposal as a way to marginalize Mr. Abbas's Palestine Authority, even though they needed to give the plan a Palestinian veneer of legitimacy. The plan's first phase envisions a temporary international mission that responds to the humanitarian crisis, establishes law and order, lays the groundwork for governance, and paves the way to uniting Gaza and the occupied West Bank under a single legitimate Palestinian authority, according to UAE Assistant Minister for Political Affairs and Special Envoy of the Foreign Ministry, Lana Nusseibeh. In an op-ed in July, Mrs. Nusseibeh said the UAE would contribute to an international security force, provided it was invited by the authority and led by the United States. Egypt, other Arab states, and European countries would likely provide contingents. The fourth force would replace Israeli troops in Gaza in phases. Israeli officials said the force would initially not include Palestinian security personnel, but could incorporate private security companies. Mrs. Nusseibeh suggested the authority and its security forces could play a more significant role once it introduces meaningful reforms and is led by a new prime minister who is empowered and independent. The proposal calls for an initial Palestinian administration made up of former government technocrats, including carefully vetted members of Hamas. The administration would be supervised by an international body that would include the United States and the UAE. Israeli officials suggested Salam Fayyad, a former Palestinian prime minister and International Monetary Fund official, could head a post war Gaza technocratic administration. Mr. Fayyad has long been a proponent of Palestinian reconciliation, which would return Hamas to the Palestinian mainstream and reform the Palestine Authority to root out corruption, improve its governance, and upgrade its security forces. What needs to happen is to expand the PLO in order to include in its ranks all Palestinian factions, especially Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The Palestinian position is best presented to the world by a united Palestinian polity. There is no other solution to the current impasse, Mr. Fayyad said earlier this year. Mr. Fayyad has yet to comment on leaked elements of the Emirati proposal. According to U.S., Israeli, and Emirati officials, the Emirati proposal is the product of ideas that were bounced around for months by Mr. Blinken, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and Mr. Netanyahu. Even so, Mr. Netanyahu opposes linking Gaza's post war transition to an eventual two state solution to the Israeli Palestinian conflict. Mr. Netanyahu also rejects giving the Palestine Authority pride of place in Gaza's administration once it has been reformed. Mr. Netanyahu has given no indication that he has softened his position on a Gaza ceasefire and post war arrangements in the Strip in the wake of last week's Israeli killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. For that matter, neither has Hamas. Even so, Mr. Netanyahu authorized Israeli negotiators to discuss a ceasefire in Doha with Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani and CIA Director Bill Burns on Sunday. Earlier this week, Mr. Blinken told families of Hamas held hostages that he was working to secure a 2-week temporary truce that would involve the release of fewer than 10 hostages to test Hamas's commitment to ending the war. Hamas has long insisted that a ceasefire end the war and facilitate the withdrawal of Israeli troops. For his part, Mr. Netanyahu maintains he needs to continue the war to free the remaining 101 hostages. Mr. Netanyahu's rejection of a permanent ceasefire and his limited endorsement of the UAE plan hasn't stopped him from creating facts on the ground. Mr. Netanyahu is considering hiring Global Delivery Company, or GDC, an Israeli US private security company, to take charge of aid distribution in Gaza. The move would serve to preempt efforts by a post war Gaza administration to rehabilitate the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, the foremost humanitarian operator in the Strip. Asserting that UNRWA is intertwined with Hamas, Mr. Netanyahu is determined to put the UN organization out of business. Hiring GDC would allow Mr. Netanyahu to address mounting US pressure to increase the flow of aid into Gaza. The US has threatened to suspend arms sales if Israel fails to significantly enhance the flow. Haaretz journalist Noah Landau warned that employing GDC would privatize military rule over Gaza. She described GDC CEO Moti Kahana's suggestion that if something happens, we'll send a message to Gaza residents, you don't want to mess with us, as a genuine mafia-style line. In interviews with Israel's Yediot Aharonot and The Guardian, Mr. Kahana demonstrated little empathy for war-ravaged Palestinians or understanding of the extent of Gaza's devastation. Mr. Kahana said he would subcontract an unidentified British security firm working in Iraq to operate on the ground in Gaza. These are British special forces. They know what they're doing, Mr. Kahana told Yediot Ahronot. Speaking to The Guardian, Mr. Kahana suggested lightly armed teams would use small armored trucks to distribute aid in designated areas. He said the teams would have riot control gear, including plastic bullets and water cannons. If the distribution teams were attacked, a nearby, more heavily armed rapid reaction force would intervene, Mr. Kahana said. Mr. Kahana's plan envisages expanding distribution areas into gated communities under armed guard. Biometrics would control access to the areas to keep Hamas operators out. It's the same as a Miami gated community, but without the pool, tennis court, and golf course, or whatever. The idea is that it's gated, it's safe. We just provide the security, and people run their own lives and take humanitarian supplies into their communities, Mr. Kahana said. Thank you for joining me today. Thousands across the globe are avid readers and listeners of the turbulent world. Join them in helping me maintain and expand the column and podcast by becoming a paid subscriber. Paid subscribers have access to the full archive, exclusive posts and polling, can leave comments, join debates, and know they are supporting independent writing, reporting, and analysis that lets the chips fall where they fall. You can contribute by going to jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you, take care, and best wishes.